Welcome back to Cowboy Ironheart. Tonight, the prairie wind carries a story of a broken heart finding its sanctuary in the wild. Let us journey back to the frontier where love is the only strength that matters. Our story begins now. She had been told across the 3 years of the marriage and the 14 months since what she was. She had been told it in the specific way that things were told without being said directly. The way that the architecture of a life communicated to the person living inside it the version of themselves they were supposed to accept. Told it through the quality of what was withheld and what was provided, through the specific daily evidence of someone who had decided what she was and who had organized the world around her to confirm the deciding. She had believed it. Not all at once, and not because she was naive, but because the sustained evidence of a life organized around a diminished version of yourself produced over sufficient time. For the specific credibility of something confirmed daily. She did not know there was another version available until the morning. She caught him watching her across the south field, and she asked him what he saw, and he told her, with the plain, honest quality of someone who only said accurate things, exactly what was there. She said, "Nobody's ever looked at me like that." He said, "I know." He said, "That's exactly the problem." Welcome to Cowboy Ironheart. If this already has you, leave us a word below. Their paths have finally crossed, but the trail ahead is long. If you're touched by this journey of healing, please subscribe and join us here at Cowboy Ironheart. Now let's see how their story unfolds. There is a particular kind of diminishment that does not announce itself and does not arrive in a single event that can be pointed to and named and addressed, the kind that operates through the accumulation of small things, through the daily architecture of a life organized by someone else around the version of you they had decided was accurate. And that produces over sufficient time the specific result of someone who has accepted the diminished version, not because they are without intelligence or perception, but because the sustained daily evidence of the diminished version has acquired the specific credibility of things that are confirmed over and over until the confirming is so complete that the questioning of the confirmation requires more interior resources than the confirmation has left available for the questioning. Rin Calloway had that kind of diminishment. And she had been living inside it for so long that the living inside it had become the available reality rather than the managed imposition on a previous reality. And the previous reality was something she had to reach back across 4 years to find, and that she was not always certain was still accessible. She had not always been the diminished version. She had been, before the events that produced it, a girl and then a young woman who existed in her full dimensions without requiring permission for the existing. That warm in the specific, genuine way of someone who was interested in the world and who communicated that interest through the quality of her attention, which was the quality she had inherited from her mother, who had been the woman who noticed what was not being said as clearly as what was and who had passed the noticing to Ren along with the small silver ring that Ren now wore on her right hand as the most immediate available reminder of who she had been before the version she was currently operating from. She had grown up in the Wyoming Territory, the only child of a farming couple who had homesteaded in the Sagebrush Hollow Valley when she was 2 years old, and who had built the Calloway farm from the ground up across her childhood. And the specific quality of her upbringing was the quality of someone who had learned the land as a first language and who had the specific relationship with the high country landscape that growing up in it produced. The relationship of someone for whom the land was not scenery, but the primary available conversation, speaking in the language of weather and season and the specific texture of the soil after a good rain. Her father had been a man of practical capability and steady warmth, who had shown her through the daily evidence of his engagement with the farm that the quality of the attention you brought to a thing was the thing that determined what you were able to do with it. Her mother had been the woman with the noticing quality who had been the emotional intelligence of the household without performing the intelligence, and who had given Ren, before she died when Ren was 19, the specific understanding that being genuinely seen by another person was one of the most significant available experiences, and that the willingness to genuinely see was one of the most significant available gifts. Her father had died 2 years after her mother, when Ren was 21, and the farm had become hers in the specific double sense of having been left to her legally, and of being the thing she had left to organize herself around in the grief of the double loss. She had managed it for 2 years with the focused, practical intelligence that was the quality she had received from her father. And the managing had been adequate in the specific sense that the farm had remained operational and the accounts had remained functional and the daily requirements had been met. She had been, in the 2 years of the solo managing, that specific kind of lonely that was different from the loneliness of someone who had no one, but was the loneliness of someone who had the land and the work and the practical requirements, and who had not yet understood that those things, while genuinely sustaining, were not the whole of what a person required. She had met Thomas Calloway at a community gathering when she was 23. He had been 28 and had the specific quality of a man who was confident in the social context, in the easy way of someone who found the social context a natural environment, who moved through rooms and gatherings with the fluency of someone for whom the management of impressions was as natural as breathing, and who had therefore developed a very thorough practice at the management without having developed the equivalent thoroughness at the thing the management was supposed to be in place of, which was the genuine presence with another person that did not require management because it was simply real. Thomas had focused on her with the attentiveness that she had found, at 23 and accustomed to the modest social landscape of the Sagebrush Hollow Valley, genuinely arresting. The attentiveness of someone who appeared to find her specifically and particularly worth the attention. And she had understood the appearing to find her worth the attention as the finding of her worth the attention, which was the specific error of 23 and of someone who had not yet had sufficient experience of the distinction between those two things to recognize it reliably. They had married within the year, and Thomas had come to the Calloway farm, which was the practical arrangement, because the Calloway farm was the established operation and because Thomas had no equivalent establishment of his own, and she had received the coming with the full generous hope of a young woman who had made a decision and who was organized around executing it well. The first year had been the year of the discovering of who Thomas actually was as distinct from who he had appeared to be, in the attentiveness of the early period, and the discovering had gone in the direction of the things that were smaller than what she had hoped. Thomas had not been unkind in the dramatic sense of the word. He had been the kind of unkind that was harder to name and harder to address, and that operated through the specific daily management of her understanding of herself. Not a single thing he did, but the accumulation of the specific quality of how he did everything in her presence. The way he heard her and did not listen, the way he looked at her and did not see, the way he responded to what she said with a social management of someone who was processing her words for their relevance to his own concerns rather than with the genuine reception of someone who was interested in what she was actually saying. The way he spoke about her to other people in the gatherings and the community events with the specific quality of someone who was describing a useful piece of their domestic infrastructure, rather than a person they were in a genuine relationship with. She had managed it with the focused patient intelligence that was her available mode for practical difficulties, and the managing had been, in this specific domain as in others, the wrong instrument. Because the patient intelligent management of a situation that was diminishing her was itself a form of the diminishment, though a way of spending the interior resources that should have been directed elsewhere on the maintenance of a situation that was producing the opposite of what she needed. She had managed it for 3 years. Thomas had died in August of the year before her current situation, in the specific way that people died sometimes from the abrupt failure of things that had been working and that stopped. The doctor had come, and the outcome had been what the outcome was, and she had found herself in the specific complicated territory of a widow, whose grief was not the grief she had expected to feel. She had expected to feel the loss of a person. She had felt instead the loss of the person she had been before the 3 years, the person who had existed in her full dimensions and who had been replaced. Through the patient-sustained process of the marriage, by the person who was operating from the diminished version. The grief for that loss was real and was specific and was the kind that did not have the clear social permission that the grief for a death had. Because explaining it to anyone in the community would have required the explaining of the 3 years. And the explaining of the 3 years was something she was not yet ready to do and was not certain the community's framework would have accommodated accurately if she had done it. She had been managing the Calloway farm alone for 14 months, and she had been managing it with the same focused, practical efficiency that was her characteristic mode for the things that required managing. The farm was operational, and the accounts were in order, and the daily requirements were being met. And she had been in the community of Sagebrush Hollow, in the specific way she had been in it for the 3 years of the marriage, which was the way of someone who was visible enough to be functional and invisible enough to not require the community's concern. She had the specific quality of someone who was competent and pleasant and who was coping adequately, which was the version she had been managing since Thomas died. And she had been maintaining it with the efficiency of someone who had been maintaining versions for long enough that the maintenance had become automatic. She had been aware of Callum Holt in the peripheral way that she had been aware of most of the community of Sagebrush Hollow across the 14 months, which was the awareness of the minimum necessary for the management of the social environment and the practical requirements of the adjacent farm situation. He had the property adjacent to the Calloway farm on the eastern boundary, which was the boundary that required the most regular practical attention, because the terrain on that side was the terrain that weather moved across first, and that therefore required the first assessment after any significant weather event. She had been aware of him as the neighbor who understood the land, and who was reliable in the practical ways that adjacent farm neighbors needed to be reliable. And she had not been aware of him in any more specific way than that. She had not been aware across the 14 months that he had been paying the kind of attention to her that was organized around the person rather than around the practical agricultural adjacency, or that the paying of that attention across the 14 months had produced in him the specific comprehensive understanding of someone who saw accurately and completely, and who had been understanding from what he saw, what the diminished version looked like from the outside, and what the actual version was that the diminished version had been placed over. She had found out on a morning in October of the current year when she had been working in the South Field, and she had become aware. Then in the specific way that people became aware of being watched, when the watching was the full quality of attention rather than the casual glance of him across the field. She had looked up and found him already looking, not with the intrusive quality of someone who had been caught in something they should not have been doing, but with the specific direct quality of someone for whom the looking was simply the available expression of where their attention was and who saw no reason to look away. She had asked him what he saw. She had asked it with the composed management of someone who had been composing their response to every social situation for a long time. But underneath the composure there had been the specific quality of someone who was also asking the real question, the question that was underneath the question, which was the question of whether what he saw matched the version she had been given or whether there was another version available, and what that other version might say about who she was. He had told her the true thing in the plain form the true thing required. And the true thing had been so different from the version she had been operating from that it had produced in her the specific disorientation of someone whose primary available reality has been revealed to be a construction rather than a fact, and who is standing in the middle of the revealing with the construction in one hand and the fact in the other, and who does not yet know what to do with either. She had said, "Nobody's ever looked at me like that." He had said, "I know." He had said, "That's exactly the problem." She had stood in the South Field in the October morning, with the Wyoming high country around her, and the amber-brown eyes doing the thing she had been managing them not to do for 4 years, which was showing what was actually there, rather than the managed portion. And she had understood, standing in the October field with the true thing still in the air between them, that the version she had been given was wrong, and that the wrongness of it was the thing that had been costing her, and that the costing was significant, and that she was going to need to understand the full size of the cost before she could understand what the not paying it anymore was going to require. She was beginning to understand. The beginning was October. She was in it. There are men who saw the world with the specific quality of someone who had learned, through the long, sustained practice of paying the right kind of attention, that what was visible on the surface of things and what was actually there were not always the same thing, and that the distance between the two was the most important available information about the thing being looked at. Callum Holt had that quality, and he had developed it not through any deliberate cultivation, but through the specific natural consequence of being someone for whom the accurate understanding of what was in front of him was the primary available form of respect for the world he was in. He had been paying that kind of attention to the land for 36 years and to the people he encountered in the course of the daily life for the same period. And the paying of it had produced the specific result that the sustained payment of the right kind of attention always produced, which was an understanding of the things he was attending to that was thorough rather than partial and accurate rather than approximate. He had grown up in southern Wyoming, the middle of three brothers in a ranching family that had been in the territory for one generation and that had the specific relationship with the high country landscape that one generation of deliberate choosing produced. The relationship of people who had looked at the available land and had selected this specific land and who therefore carried in their engagement with it the quality of something chosen rather than assumed. His father had been a man of considerable physical capability and very little unnecessary language, whose primary mode of communication was the quality of what he did, and who had given Callum, through the demonstration of it over the years of his upbringing, the understanding that the seeing of a thing accurately was itself an act, and that the act had value independent of what was done with the seeing. His mother had been a woman of quick intelligence and the specific warmth of someone who was interested in people in their particularity, and who had given Callum the quality of his attention to people, which was the quality of someone for whom the specific person in front of them was always more interesting than the general category they occupied. He had been large since adolescence and had made the specific peace with the largeness that large men made over time. If they were honest about it, the peace of someone who understood that the size was a fact about the environment rather than a statement about the person occupying it, and who had developed through the long practice of inhabiting significant space with the minimum necessary imposition, the specific unhurried deliberateness of his movement that was no longer a practice but simply how he was in the world. He was not a man who announced himself. He was a man who was simply where he was and who was entirely there, which was itself the announcement of a kind that did not require the particular effort of someone who needed to be noticed. He had come to the Sagebrush Hollow area 7 years ago when the land adjacent to what would become the Calloway farm had been available, and when his accumulated capital had made the purchase possible. Had built the Holt operation across the 7 years with the patient, systematic quality that was his characteristic mode for building things correctly rather than quickly. And the result was the operation that lasting building produced, which was the one that was there in the bad years the same way it was there in the good ones. He was known in Sagebrush Hollow as the quiet Holt rancher who understood his land and did what he said, and whose opinion on matters pertaining to the high country ranch work was worth having because the 7 years of the specific attentiveness he had brought to the Sagebrush Hollow land had produced an understanding of it that was the kind that came only from that specific quality of sustain. That attention. He had known the Calloway farm before. Wren was its only occupant. Had known Thomas Calloway in the way of adjacent farmers who understood each other's operations and who maintained the practical relationship that adjacent operations in serious country required. And he had known Wren Calloway in the same practical way across the 3 years of the marriage. He had been aware of her in the way he was aware of most things in his regular environment, which was comprehensively and without the particular agenda that would have made the awareness into something it was not yet appropriate to be. He had registered her with the full quality of his characteristic attentiveness, and what he had registered had settled in him in the interior place where the things that mattered settled, without being elaborated or acted upon. Because the acting upon was not the appropriate response to the information at the time, the information was available. What he had registered across the 3 years of his acquaintance with Wren Calloway, as Thomas's wife, was the specific quality of someone who was more than the position she was occupying. The quality of someone whose interior engagement with the world was considerably richer and more complete than the exterior she was maintaining in the specific presence of the man she was married to, and whose exterior in his presence had the specific managed quality of someone who had learned to be less visible in the presence of a particular person, because the being more visible had produced specific consequences. He had understood this quality because he had the kind of attention that recognized it accurately. And he had filed the understanding without acting on it because the acting on it required a legitimacy it did not have while Thomas Calloway was alive. Thomas had died in August. Callum had heard about it in the way that communities heard about such things, quickly and from multiple sources. And he had received the news with the specific quality of response that was appropriate to it, which was the genuine sympathy for a death and the genuine practical concern for a neighbor who was now managing alone a farm that had been designed for more than one person. He had offered the practical assistance that the immediate period required, and had continued to offer the practical forms of assistance that the 14 months since had periodically required. Not more than the situation warranted, and not in any form that could be mistaken for anything other than what it was, which was the practical support of an adjacent farmer for a neighboring farm that was short-handed. He had been watching her across the 14 months with the same comprehensive patient attentiveness. He had been watching most things in his regular environment, and the watching had been producing. With each month of the watching, a clearer and more thorough picture of what he was looking at, which was a woman who was managing with the competence she had, but who was managing from a position that was smaller than her actual position, operating from the diminished version of herself, as though the diminished version were the accurate one. He had been understanding this more thoroughly with each month of the watching, and he had been patient with the understanding in the way he was patient with most things that required patience, which was the active way of someone who was present to the situation and who was not going to act before the acting was the right thing. He had not intended for her to see him watching on the October morning. He had been at the eastern boundary fence doing the autumn assessment of the fence infrastructure that the season required, and his position at the fence had placed him in the line of sight across the south field where she was working. And he had been watching her in the specific way that was simply the expression of where his attention was, and that he had not been managing because the managing of where his attention was felt dishonest in the specific way that managing things to produce a social result rather than an honest one felt dishonest. And he was not a man who did things for the social result rather than the honest one. He had been watching her work in the south field with the specific quality of attention that was simply his quality when he was attending to something that mattered. The quality of full comprehensive presence directed at the thing being attended to without any of the social performance that would have made the attending into something displayed rather than actual. She had been moving through the field work with the focused efficiency that was her characteristic mode for practical tasks. And the efficiency was the thing he always noticed first, because it was the most immediately visible expression of the specific quality he had been understanding across the 14 months, which was the quality of someone who had been directing their full capability into the practical requirements of the daily life, because the practical requirements were the domain where the full capability was permitted without the specific social cost that the full capability in other domains had been taught to produce. She had looked up and found him watching, and he had not looked away because looking away would have been the social management of the moment into something more comfortable than the honest version of it. And he was not interested in the more comfortable version. He had held her gaze with the dark gray eyes in the October morning, and she had held his with the amber-brown ones. And the holding of the mutual gaze had the quality of two people who were in the moment of something becoming visible that had been present for a while and that had not yet been acknowledged. She had asked him what he saw. He had heard the question, and he had understood it, not just the surface of it, which was the social question of someone who had noticed the watching and who was asking for an account of it, but the interior of it, which was the question of someone who had been told a version of themselves for long enough that they were asking a person who appeared to see them in a different way, what that different way consisted of. He had understood both the surface and the interior because that was how he understood things, which was completely, and she had given her the answer. That was the answer to both. He had said what he saw. He had said it in the plain, direct form that was his characteristic form for saying things that were true and that he understood to be significant, without the social management that would have softened it, or the elaboration that would have made it into a performance of the saying. He had told her what was actually there, which was the full version and not the diminished one. And the telling of it had been the most direct available form of communicating something he had understood for a long time, and that she had not yet been given the opportunity to know. He had said, "I see someone who has been told the wrong thing about herself for long enough that she has started to believe the telling." He had said, "I see someone whose actual capability and actual quality are considerably larger than the version she has been operating from." He had said, "I see someone who works with the specific quality of a person who is bringing their full capability to the available domain because the available domain is where the full capability has been permitted, and who does not understand that the permission was always hers and was never anyone else's to grant or withhold." He had said, "I see someone who is beautiful in the way that people are beautiful when the beauty is the direct expression of who they actually are, rather than the management of how they appear." He had said, I see someone who has been invisible to herself. He had said it with the dark gray eyes and the plain honest quality of his characteristic mode, without any of the performance that would have made it a compliment, rather than an accurate description. Simply as the report of what was there. And she had received it with the amber-brown eyes and the specific quality of someone who had been handed something that was simultaneously the truest and most disorienting thing they had been told in a very long time. She had said, "Nobody's ever looked at me like that." He had said, "I know." He had said, "That's exactly the problem." He had said it with the same plain quality, not as an indictment of what her life had been, but as the accurate identification of the specific condition. The naming of the thing that needed to be named before it could be addressed. She had stood in the south field with the October morning around her, and the full weight of what he had said being received by the interior that had been waiting, without knowing it was waiting, for exactly that kind of reception. He had gone back to the Eastern Fence assessment with the same unhurried quality of someone for whom the practical work was always available, when the significant thing had been said and did not need to be elaborated further. He had said what was true, the saying of it was complete. What came next was hers to do with what she would do with it. He had given her the accurate version. She was in the process of understanding what to do with having it. She stood in the south field for longer than the south field's practical requirements warranted after he had gone back to the Eastern Fence assessment. And the standing was the specific standing of someone who had received something significant and who needed the standing to be what it was before the moving on to the next thing was available. The October morning was around her with the specific quality of a Wyoming October morning that was honest about what it was, which was the beginning of the serious season. The sky the clear cold blue of high country autumn and the light coming in low with the specific angle that the season produced and that showed everything it fell on with the particular clarity of light that had no remaining warmth in it and that therefore illuminated without softening. She was in the field in the October light, and she was holding what he had said in both hands and looking at it with the full quality of her attention. Nobody had said that to her before. Not in the form he had said it, and not with the quality he had said it with. Which was the quality of someone who was reporting what was actually there, rather than producing the particular social output that the situation called for. She had received compliments before across the years. The social kind that were the available currency of community life and that were produced and received with the specific mutual understanding that they were the social currency and not the report of a direct observation. She had received Thomas's particular assessments of her, which were the assessments of someone who had organized his understanding of her around the version that served his own understanding of himself and that had been communicated primarily through what was withheld rather than what was said. She had received the community's version of her, which was the version of the competent, pleasant widow who was managing adequately and who did not require the community's concern. She had not received what Callum Holt had just given her, which was the accurate observation of someone who had been paying the right kind of attention for a sufficient duration to have built a thorough understanding of what was actually there, and who had communicated that understanding in the plain, direct form of someone who was not going to say anything other than what was true. She was trying to understand the shape of the thing she had received. Not to dismiss it, the dismissing would have been the managed response. The response of someone who received a true thing and put it in the category of things that were not to be taken seriously because the taking of them seriously required more interior resources than the not taking them seriously. She had been doing the managed response to significant things for 4 years, and she had been doing it because the managed response was the one that was safe, and the safe response was the one that cost the least in the immediate term, which was the term she had been operating from. The immediate term had been the only available term for 4 years. She understood now, standing in the south field, that the immediate term was becoming something longer, and the longer term required a different kind of response than the managed one. She went to him at the Eastern Fence at mid-morning, when the south field's work had been completed and the day's next task had not yet made itself urgent. He was at the section he had been working when she had found him working through the autumn assessment with the systematic thoroughness that was evidently his characteristic mode for the practical work. Checking each post and each wire with the focused attention of someone who was building an accurate picture of the section's condition rather than executing a cursory pass. He heard her coming across the field, and he looked up with the dark gray eyes and waited with the specific patient quality of his waiting, which was the waiting that did not require the waited for to hurry. She said, "I need to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said. "What you said this morning." He said, "Yes." She said, "Tell me what you based it on." He said, "What I've observed." She said, "Over what period?" He said, 14 months of the adjacency. He said, "And 3 years before that." She said, "You've been observing me for 4 years." He said, "I've been paying attention to everything on this side of the valley for 7 years." He said, "You have been on this side of the valley for 4 years." He said, "The paying of attention is not selective." She said, "But what you said this morning was specific." He said, "Yes." He said, "The specific things are the result of the sustained observation." He said, "You pay attention to something long enough with the right quality of attention, and the specific things emerge from the general picture." She said, "And what emerged?" He looked at her across the fence with the dark gray eyes in the October afternoon, and he said, "Tell me first what you've been told." She said, "What I've been told." He said, "About yourself." He said, "Tell me the version you've been operating from, and I'll tell you where it diverges from, what I've observed." She was quiet for a moment, with the amber-brown eyes in the afternoon light, and the wind coming across the field with the October quality it had. She said, "The version I've been operating from is the version of someone who is adequate," he said. "Adequate," she said. "Functional," she said. "Reliable in the practical sense." She said, "Not more than that," he said. "In whose assessment?" she said. "Thomas's." He was quiet for the length of time that told her he was giving the honest weight to what she had said before he responded to it. He said, "Thomas Calloway's assessment of you was organized around what was useful for Thomas Calloway's understanding of himself." He said, "That is a specific kind of assessment, and it produces a specific kind of result." He said, "The result is not the accurate version of the thing being assessed." He said, "It is the version that served the assessor." She said, "You're saying his version of me was wrong." He said, "I'm saying his version of you was his, not yours." He said, "Those are different things," she said. "They produced the same result." He said, "Yes." He said, "They did." He said, "The result is you standing in a south field in October believing you are adequate, when what I have observed for 4 years is someone who is considerably more than adequate in every domain she has been permitted to operate in, and who has been operating from a version of herself that was not built from the accurate material." She said, "Tell me what you mean by the accurate material." He said, "I mean the specific things I have observed." She said, "Tell me the specific things." He said, "Are you sure?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Then I will tell you." He told her. He told her the specific things with the same plain, honest quality he had brought to the South Field observation, without the elaboration that would have made it a performance, and without the softening that would have made it less true. He told her about the specific quality of her work in the field, which was the quality of someone who was bringing their full capability to the available task. And that was different in kind from the work of someone who was executing the minimum required or even the adequate. Was the work of someone who was genuinely present in the doing of it in the way that produced results that were better than the results of even consistent competence because they were the results of genuine engagement. He told her about the specific quality of how she managed the practical difficulties that the 14 months of the solo operation had presented, which were the specific difficulties of a farm that had been designed for 2 people being managed by 1 person with the intelligence that understood the farm's requirements accurately and who addressed them in the order of their actual urgency rather than the order of their visibility, which was a different order and a more accurate one, and which was itself the evidence of the specific quality of the intelligence being applied to the problem. He told her about the specific quality of how she was in the community of Sagebrush Hollow, which was the quality of someone who was genuinely present with the people she was with in the specific way that produced genuine exchange rather than managed social performance, and that was itself a form of the full capability being expressed in the available domain. He told her about the quality of how she understood the land, which was the quality of someone who had grown up in it, and who had the specific relationship with the high country landscape that growing up in it produced. The relationship that was in the body rather than the mind, and that expressed itself in the specific accuracy of the decisions she made about the farm's management in relation to the season and the weather and the specific conditions of the particular year. He told her about the morning light on the south field and the specific quality of watching her move through it, with the full engagement of someone who was entirely in the work. And he described what he saw with the specific, honest detail of someone who was reporting an accurate observation and who understood the observation to be significant. She stood at the eastern fence, and she received everything he said with the full quality of her attention, which was the quality she had been told was too much. That she paid too much attention and noticed too much and expected too much from the attending, and which she now understood. Receiving it back from someone who was paying the same quality of attention to her was not too much, but was simply the right quality of attention and was the thing she had always been, and that had been named wrong. She said when he had finished, "I don't know what to do with this." He said, "You don't have to do anything with it right now." He said, "It's information." He said, "Information becomes available, and then you have it, and what you do with it is a subsequent question." She said, "The information is that the version of myself I've been operating from is wrong." He said, "The information is that the version you've been operating from was not built from the accurate material." He said, "What you do with the accurate material is yours to determine." She said, "Why are you telling me this?" He said, "Because it is true." He said, "And because the withholding of a true thing from a person who needs it is a form of the same thing that produced the wrong version in the first place." Which is someone who had the accurate information and who did not give it to you. She said, "You think I needed it." He said, "I think you have been operating from the wrong version for 4 years, and that the operating from the wrong version has been costing you the specific things that the right version would have made available." She said, "What things?" He said, "The ability to understand your own capability accurately." He said, "The ability to make decisions from the actual position rather than the diminished one." He said, "The ability to receive the correct kind of attention without managing it away, because the managing of it has become the automatic response to attention of any kind." She was quiet for a long moment. She said, "You noticed that?" He said, "Yes." She said, "That I manage attention away." He said, "Yes." He said, "The quality of the managing told me something about the history of what had produced it." She said, "You understood my history from watching me manage attention." He said, "I understood the general shape of it." He said, "You have just confirmed the specific content." She said, "That is a very specific observation." He said, "I've had 7 years to observe specific things." She said, "Callum." He said, "Yes." She said, "Nobody has ever told me those specific things about myself." He said, "I know." He said, "The not being told was itself the specific thing I was looking at. When you asked me what I saw," she said, "you were watching me and thinking about the not being told." He said, "I was watching you and thinking about the distance between who you are and who you appear to believe you are." He said, "The distance is significant." She said, "You've been watching that distance for 4 years." He said, "Since I understood what I was looking at," he said, which was approximately the 2nd year of the marriage. She said, "You saw it that early." He said, "I pay attention." He said, "The not seeing her quality was visible from the outside from the 2nd year." She said, "And you waited." He said, "It was not my place to do anything other than wait." He said, "It became my place when the marriage ended, and when 14 months had passed, and when you were in the South Field in October, and you asked me what I saw." She said, "I asked you." He said, "Yes." He said, "You asked?" He said, "I answered." She said, "With the full accurate answer." He said, "Yes." He said, "The only kind I know how to give." She stood at the fence line in the October afternoon with the amber-brown eyes that were showing everything, and the wind coming across the field and the Wyoming sky above them, and she said, "What do I do with the accurate material?" He said, "You start with the understanding that it is accurate." He said, "That is the first thing, and it is the most significant thing." He said, "The rest follows from that." She said, "The understanding that it is accurate?" He said, "Yes." He said, "That the wrong version was wrong." He said, "Not a version of you that you were not measuring up to." He said, "A version that was never you in the first place." She said, "Never me." He said, "No." He said, "The specific material was always the accurate material." He said, "What was placed over it was not." She stood with that. She stood with it for the length of time that it required to stand with, which was a significant length of time. And he did not rush her and did not fill the standing time with anything, because the standing time was hers and was doing the work it needed to do, and the appropriate response to someone doing necessary work was to give it the space it required. She stood with the accurate material and the specific thing it required of her, which was the revision of the primary available assumption she had been making about herself for 4 years.
And the revision was not comfortable, but it was honest. And the honest version was better than the comfortable one in the specific way that honest things were always better than comfortable ones.
Which was that they were true. She said, "This is going to take some time." He said, "Yes." He said, "The things that were built over a long time take a long time to understand fully." He said, "That is not a problem." He said, "That is simply the nature of the work." She said, "You're patient about things that take time." He said, "The things worth understanding take the time they take." He said, "Attempting to rush them produces an incomplete understanding." She said, "You've had 7 years of patience." He said, "The 7 years were productive." He said, "I understand this valley and this land considerably better than I did when I arrived." He said it with the dry, plain quality that she was going to understand later was his version of humor. The dry, understated quality of someone who communicated the thing that was also something else in the form of the thing rather than in the elaboration of the something else. She received it with the amber brown eyes and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "Yes." She said, "I imagine you do." He said, "Yes." He said, "I imagine I do." She said, "Callum." He said, "Yes." She said, "Thank you." He said, "You're welcome." He said it with the plain, genuine quality of someone for whom the thank you and the you're welcome were the accurate exchange rather than the social performance of it. And she received it with the same quality, and she went back across the south field toward the Calloway farm and the afternoon's remaining work. She walked with the October afternoon around her, and the accurate material in her hands, and the beginning of the understanding that the beginning required, which was the understanding that the version she had been given was wrong, and that the wrong version was not her fault, and that the not being her fault was itself the accurate material. She was not the adequate version. She was not the version that was less than what she appeared to be hoping she might be allowed to be. She was the version he had described, the version that had been there the whole time, underneath the version that had been placed over it. She walked with it, and she did not know yet what she was going to do with it. But she had it now, and the having of it was the first available thing, and it was enough for the October afternoon. She had it. That was the beginning. November arrived in Sagebrush Hollow with the specific quality of a Wyoming November that had decided to be what it was without any of the transitional tentifons that October had provided. Cold and committed, and the specific flat sky gray of the high country moving into the serious season. The kind of gray that was not the gray of rain, but the gray of altitude. In late autumn, when the sky settled into the color it was going to be for the next several months, and that communicated. To the people who had been through enough Wyoming winters to read it accurately, the specific information about what was coming. Wren had been through 2 Wyoming Novembers, and this was the beginning of her 3rd, and she could read the sky in the specific way she had not been able to read it in the first November, which was the way of someone who had the accumulated knowledge of the previous cycles in their body, and who understood the sky as a form of language they were becoming fluent in. She had been thinking about the Southfield conversation with the specific ongoing quality of someone who had received something significant and who was doing the sustained, honest work of understanding what the significant thing meant and what it required from them. She was doing the work in the specific patient way that she was learning was the only way to do this particular work, which was without rushing toward a conclusion and without managing it into a shape that was more comfortable than the honest shape. The honest shape was the shape of a revision, and revisions were not comfortable, but they were necessary when the previous version was wrong. And she was committed to the honest shape, because the committed to honesty was itself one of the things the accurate material had always been, and that had been suppressed by the wrong version. The accurate material. She'd been holding the phrase in the interior place where she held significant things, and she had been turning it over with the patient attention of someone who was committed to understanding something fully. What he had said was this: the specific material was always the accurate material, and what was placed over it was not. She had been understanding this not in the abstract, but in the specific, which was the way she understood most things that mattered. Going back through the 4 years with the clear-eyed quality that was available to her now, in a way it had not been available when she was inside the 4 years. And what she was finding in the going back was the specific evidence that supported what he had said, which was the evidence of the full capability being present in the domains where the full capability had been permitted, and the evidence of the suppression in the domains where it had not. She had been competent at the farm work throughout the 3 years of the marriage, because the farm work was the domain where Thomas had not had the investment in reducing her, where the practical capability was a resource for the operation that he had no interest in diminishing because the diminishing of it would have cost him something he did not want to pay. She had been reduced in the other domains, the domains of what she was permitted to find important, and what she was permitted to say aloud, and what she was permitted to expect from the shared life, and what she was permitted to believe about herself and her value. The reduction had been systematic and patient and organized around the version of her that Thomas had decided was the correct version. And it had operated with the specific efficiency of something that was the primary organizing project of the person doing it. She had understood this before the Southfield conversation. She had been understanding it across the 14 months since Thomas died in the specific incremental way of things that became clear when the specific conditions that had been preventing the clarity but were no longer present. But the understanding had been the interior understanding of someone who was revising a version of themselves without having the external confirmation that the revision was moving in the right direction, without the specific anchor of someone else's accurate observation to orient the revision against. What Callum had given her was the anchor. Not the revision itself, she was doing the revision and it was hers to do, and he had understood that and had given her the information rather than the conclusion, which was the correct form of the giving. But the anchor was what made the revision navigable rather than disorienting, gave it the specific orientation of someone who was moving toward something rather than simply away from something. And the difference between those two directions was the difference between a recovery and a displacement, between rebuilding and simply leaving. She went to the eastern fence on a Thursday morning in the second week of November with no practical purpose for the going beyond the purpose of needing to say something that she had been understanding across the 3 weeks since the South Field and that had arrived. The November morning at the completeness that permitted the saying. He was at the fence which she had not expected and had understood was possible, doing the early winter maintenance that the season required. He looked up when he heard her and said, "Good morning." She said, "Good morning," she said. "I need to tell you something." He said, "Tell me." She told him about the revision. Not the full inventory of it, not yet. The full inventory required more time and more of the specific interior work, and she was not going to offer what was not yet complete. But she told him the shape of it, the general, honest architecture of what the 3 weeks of the Southfield conversation's reverberations had produced, which was the understanding that the version she had been operating from was not simply inadequate, but was specifically wrong, and that the wrongness was organized, and that the organization had been the project of someone whose interests were served by the organized wrongness, and that the interests were not hers, and had never been hers, and that the serving of them had been the cost, and the cost was the 4 years. He listened with the complete quality of his characteristic listening, the full present quality that received what was offered without managing the receiving toward a specific result. And when she finished, he was quiet, for the honest length of time that told her he was giving it the weight it deserved before saying anything. Then he said the understanding of the shape of it is the significant work. He said the inventory is what follows the shape. He said, "You have the shape." She said, "Yes." She said, "I have the shape." He said, "What does it look like from the inside?" She said, "It looks like the difference between a cost I've been paying without knowing I was paying it and the understanding that I don't have to continue paying it." He said, "Yes." He said, "That is the shape." She said, "The not paying it is what I'm working toward." He said, "Yes." He said, "What does the not paying it require?" She said, "It requires me to understand what I'm actually worth, so that I understand what the paying it was costing and why the not paying it is both available and right." He said, "And do you have that understanding?" She said, "I'm building it." He said, "Yes." He said, "I know." He said, "I can see you building it from here." She said, "What does the building look like from the outside?" He said, "It looks like someone who is reclaiming the full dimensions of a space they had been occupying at reduced capacity." He said, "It looks like someone moving back into the rooms they had vacated." She said, "That's exactly what it feels like." He said, "Yes." He said, "I know." She said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because the quality of how you're at the fence line this morning is different from the quality of how you were at it 3 weeks ago." She said, "In what way?" He said, "3 weeks ago you were asking me a question from the diminished position." He said, "This morning you are telling me something from a position that is larger than 3 weeks ago." He said, "The telling, rather than the asking, is itself the evidence of the building." She received that with the amber brown eyes and said nothing for a moment, because the nothing was the appropriate response to something that was accurate, and that she was receiving as the accurate. The thing rather than managing into something more comfortable. She said, "You notice very specific things," he said. "The specific things are the things worth noticing." He said, "The general things take care of themselves." The November visits to the eastern fence became the rhythm of the weeks in the way that rhythms became established, when they were the natural expression of something real rather than the production of something performed. She went to the fence on the Thursday mornings, and he was often at the fence for the practical work of the season, and they talked with the specific quality that their conversations had developed since the South Field, which was the quality of two people who were honest with each other in the specific way that was only available after the kind of honesty that the Southfield conversation had been. She told him the things she was understanding, and he listened with the full quality and said the true things, and occasionally the dry, understated things that she was learning to recognize as his humor and that she was finding, with each encounter of it, to be one of the more reliably pleasant features of the conversations. He told her things too, the things from the interior place where he kept the things that mattered. The specific observations about the land and the season and the particular qualities of the Sagebrush Hollow Valley that he had been noting for 7 years and that he was sharing with her in the specific way of someone who had found the right person to share them with. He told her about the specific quality of the November light in the valley, which was the quality of light that had lost its warmth but retained its clarity in a way that was different from the winter light that would follow. And that showed the landscape in a specific, honest way that the other season's light did not. The way of something that was past the illusions of the warmer months, and that was simply itself. She listened with the full quality and received what he was sharing with the same full quality. And the receiving was the genuine receiving of someone who was actually interested, rather than the managed receiving of someone who was executing the social ritual of attentiveness. She brought him tea on the last Thursday of November at the fence line, which she had not done before, and which she did now because the doing of it was the natural available expression of the kind of presence the conversations had produced between them. The presence of someone who wanted to provide for the person they were in the company of, in the small practical ways that were available. She had made it in the morning before going to the fence, and she brought it in the thermos and poured it at the fence post, and he received it with the dark gray eyes and the plain, genuine quality of someone for whom the small practical kindness was exactly what it was, and who was not going to perform a reaction to it that was larger than what it was. He said, "Thank you," she said, "Of course." And they drank the tea at the fence line in the November morning, and the gray sky was above them, and the valley was doing what the valley did in November, and neither of them required anything from the moment except that the moment be what it was. She said, "Tell me something from the list of 7 years." He said, "Which part of the list?" She said, "The part that is specific to this valley." He said, "That is most of the list." He said, 7 years of paying attention to one specific valley produces a substantial list, she said. Then start wherever the starting feels right. He started. He told her about the specific quality of the creek in the valley in the deepest part of winter when the water moved under the ice and produced a specific sound that was different from the summer sound and from the autumn sound and from the spring sound, and that was the sound of something that had gone as deep as it was going to go, and that was maintaining its essential nature underneath that surface that the cold had imposed on it. She listened with the full quality, and when he finished, she said, "That is a beautiful thing to have noticed." He said, "The creek produces it every year." He said, "I've been noting it for 7 years." She said, "You've been noting it alone." He said, "Yes." He said, "Until now." She looked at him across the fence line in the November morning, and the amber-brown eyes were doing the full work they were capable of, and he looked back with the dark gray ones, and neither of them said anything further because nothing further needed to be said. She was aware of him in November with the full quality of awareness that was the awareness she had been building toward since October. The awareness that was not the peripheral monitoring of the social environment, but the specific, genuine awareness of someone who was interested in the person they were attending to and who found the attending to be one of the more significant available activities of the daily life. She was aware of the specific quality of how he occupied the fence line in the mornings, which was the quality of someone for whom the practical work was entirely genuine, and who brought to it the same quality of full engagement that she had been learning to bring back to her own work. She was aware of the specific quality of his patience, which was the patience she had observed him describe and that she was experiencing from the inside, and that was the patience of someone for whom the things worth understanding were simply the things that took the time they took, and for whom the rushing of them was a form of the not respecting the thing rather than a form of efficiency. She brought him the cornbread she had made on the first Friday of December, not at the fence line, but at the Holt property itself, which she had not done before, and which she did now because the cornbread was the specific thing she had made that morning, for reasons she had not entirely examined, and because the making of it had produced in her the understanding that it was for him and that the bringing of it was the available honest action in response to that understanding. He was in the yard when she arrived, and he looked at her with the dark gray eyes and at the cornbread in the covered dish, and he said, "Come in." She came in. His kitchen was the kitchen of a man who had been alone in it for 7 years, and that had the functional quality of a space organized by one person for one person, and that had not yet had the quality of 2 people in it. She set the cornbread on the table, and he made coffee, and they sat at the table, and the December morning was outside the window, and the kitchen was warm in the specific way of kitchens that were warm from the work of being lived in. And neither of them said anything for a moment, because the moment was itself the thing, and the thing required only their presence in it. He said, "Tell me what you've been building this week." She said, "The understanding that the capable version was always the actual version." He said, "Yes." She said that the adequate version was a construction and not the material. He said, "Yes." She said, "I've been sitting with the specific evidence of it." He said, "What evidence?" "Abristiolus, impedaf." She said, "The 14 months," she said. "The managing of the farm alone for 14 months, with the quality you described." He said, "Yes." She said, "If the adequate version were the accurate one, the 14 months would have looked different." He said, "Yes." He said, "They would have looked like someone managing at the limit of their capacity, rather than someone managing well within it and applying the excess to the managing of the reduced version." She said, "The excess has been going to the managing of the reduced version." He said, "Yes." He said, "That is the specific cost." She said, "The cost is the difference between what the excess has been paying for and what it could have been paying for instead." He said, "Yes." She said, "That is a significant difference." He said, "Yes." He said, "It is." She said, "Callum?" He said, "Yes." She said, "The cornbread is because I understand something I didn't understand a month ago." He said, "Tell me," she said. "I understand that the right kind of attention is a specific thing and that I am capable of recognizing it, and that the recognition is itself the evidence that the version he had me believing was wrong." He said, "Yes." He said, "The recognition is the evidence." She said, "Because someone who was only adequate in the way he said would not be capable of recognizing the specific quality of the right kind of attention." He said, "No." He said, "They would not." She said, "But I did." He said, "Yes." He said, "You did." She said, "From the first time." He said, "From the South Field in October." She said, "Yes." She said, "From the South Field in October." He said, "Yes." He said, "I know." She said, "You knew that I recognized it." He said, "I watched you recognize it." He said, "The recognizing was visible." She said, "And you waited." He said, "Yes." He said, "The recognizing required the time it required." He said, "The next part will also require the time it requires." She said, "What is the next part?" He said, "That is something you will tell me when you arrive at it." He said, "I will be here when you arrive." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the December morning with the amber-brown eyes and said, "Yes." She said, "I believe you will." He said, "Yes." He said, "I will." December in Sagebrush Hollow was the month that settled everything into its winter truth without apology and without transition. The cold was the specific cold of the Wyoming high country in December, which was the cold that was simply itself without the mitigating qualities that the other cold months permitted. And the light was the short light of the latitude and the altitude combined that produced days that were genuinely beautiful in the specific way of things that were brief and that were more fully themselves for the brevity. Rin had been through 2 December cycles in Sagebrush Hollow, and this was the beginning of her third, and she was receiving it differently from how she had received the previous 2. Receiving it with the quality of presence that had been developing since the Southfield and the fence line conversations, and the December kitchen table. The quality of someone who was more present in the world they were inhabiting than they had been in the months before. The interior work was going the way it went when the interior work was being done correctly, and was far enough along to have the specific quality of something that was generating momentum rather than simply requiring effort. She was understanding more in December than she had understood in November, and more in November than in October. Not because she was rushing the understanding, but because the sustained, honest attention to a significant thing produced, over sufficient time, the specific compounding quality of something that was building on what had already been built. She was building the understanding of herself from the accurate material rather than the construction, and the building had the quality that all building from accurate material had, which was the quality of something that was genuinely solid under the feet rather than the quality of something that looked solid from the outside, and that shifted when you put your weight on it. She had been telling Callum the things she was building as she was building them in the specific incremental way that the fence line conversations and the kitchen table conversations had established. Not the full inventory, but the shape of it as the shape became available. The honest ongoing report of someone who was doing significant interior work alongside someone who had given them the anchor and who was maintaining the presence that the anchor required to be an anchor rather than simply an object. He received the ongoing reports with the complete quality that was his characteristic quality for everything she told him. The quality that was organized around her rather than around what the information told him about his own position or his own interests. And the receiving of it in that quality was itself one of the most significant elements of the building. Because the receiving of a thing in the right quality was itself evidence that the right quality was real and available, and that she was not mistaken in her recognition of it. She told him in the second week of December about the specific quality of the recognition she had described at the kitchen table, elaborating on it in the specific incremental way that her understanding was elaborating. She said, "I've been thinking about the recognition," he said. "Yes," she said. "The fact that I recognized the right kind of attention from the Southfield morning," he said. "Yes." She said, "I've been thinking about what it means that I could recognize it," he said. "What have you concluded?" She said, "That the recognizing was always available." She said that I have always had the capacity for the right kind of attention in both directions, giving and receiving. He said, "Yes." She said, "And that the 3 years produced in me the specific condition of someone who had suppressed the receiving capacity because the receiving of the wrong kind of attention in the wrong form had been the available condition and the suppression was the protection." He said, "Yes." He said the suppression was the appropriate response to the available condition. He said the condition has changed. She said the condition has changed. She said, "The protection is still operative." He said, "Yes." He said, "That is the nature of protections that have been in place for a long time." He said, "They continue to operate past the condition that produced them." He said, "The work is the understanding that the condition has changed and that the protection can be retired." She said, "Retired, not removed." He said, "Yes." He said, "Retired is the accurate word." He said, "The protection was earned and was appropriate and deserves to be acknowledged for what it did rather than discarded as something that should not have been there." She said, "You think the protection was right?" He said, "I think the protection was the correct response to the situation that produced it." He said, "I think you should honor it rather than be ashamed of it." She received that with the full quality and held it in the interior place for the length of time it required, and then said, "That is not the way I've been thinking about it." He said, "How have you been thinking about it?" She said, "As something I need to overcome." He said, "No." He said, "As something you need to understand." He said, "There is a difference." She said, "Tell me the difference." He said, Overcoming implies that the protection was wrong and that the correct posture is to be without it, he said. Understanding implies that the protection was right for its time and that the current posture is to recognize that the time has changed and that the protection can be put down gently rather than defeated. She said, "Put down gently." He said, "Yes." He said, "The things that kept you functional during a difficult period deserve the gentleness of being put down rather than the force of being overcome." She said, "That is a very specific way to think about it." He said, "Yes." He said, "I've had occasion to think about it." She said, "You've put something down gently." He said, "Yes." He said, "Years ago." He said, "I understand what the gentle putting down requires." She said, "What does it require?" He said, "The acknowledgement that what you are putting down was genuinely useful and genuinely necessary." He said, "And the understanding that its usefulness was specific to a time that is now past." He said, "And the specific act of choosing to live in the current time rather than in the protection of the previous one." She said, "The current time." He said, "Yes." He said, "The current time is different from the time that required the protection." He said, "The current time has different available conditions." She said, "What are the available conditions?" He said, "You're at a fence line in Wyoming in December, talking to someone who sees the accurate version." He said it with the dry, plain quality, and she received it with the amber brown eyes and something that was the specific, genuine quality of the smile she had been reserving for when the spending was worth it, and that had been making itself available more frequently since October. And he received the smile with the dark gray eyes and the specific expression that was barely visible and entirely genuine. That was his fullest expression. She said, "I'm going to tell you something." He said, "Tell me." She said, "The reason I asked you what you saw in the South Field." He said, "Yes." She said, "I asked it because I had been aware of you watching, and because the quality of the watching was different from any quality of watching I had encountered before." He said, "Different how?" She said, "It was the quality I described at the kitchen table." She said, "The quality of attention organized around the actual thing rather than around what the attention produced for the person providing it." He said, "Yes." She said, "I had been aware of it for some time before October." He said, "Tell me when you became aware of it." She said, "In the first month after Thomas died." He said, "Yes." She said, "You came to assess the fence in September of the first year." He said, "Yes." She said, "And the quality of how you were at the fence was the quality of someone for whom the fence was the actual thing, and I was the actual person, and neither of us was a means to any other thing." He said, "Yes." She said, "I didn't have language for it then." He said, "No." She said, "But I filed it." He said, "Yes." He said, "I know you filed it." She said, "You know." He said, "The quality of how you were at subsequent fence occasions told me you had filed something from the first one." He said, "You were paying attention to me, paying attention to you." She said, "Yes." She said, "I was?" He said, "What did your paying attention to?" "My paying attention tell you." She said that the quality was consistent. He said, "Yes." She said that it was the same quality every time. He said, "Yes." She said that it was not a performance that varied based on what I did or did not provide in return. He said, "No." He said, "It is not a performance." She said, "I know." She said, "That is what I have been understanding." She said, "The non-performance of it is the thing that required the most understanding, because I was accustomed to performance, and the non-performance of it looked like nothing at first, because I was looking for the performance and didn't find it." He said, "Yes." He said, "The absence of the performance is not nothing." He said, "The absence of the performance is the specific form the real thing takes." She said, "Yes." She said, "I understand that now." The darkest moment arrived in the third week of December through the specific social channel of someone who cared genuinely, and whose expression of the caring was filtered through a framework that was not entirely adequate to the specific situation. It arrived through Mrs. Elmore, who was the school teacher's wife and who had been consistently kind to Wren across the 14 months of the widowhood, and whose care for her was real, and who arrived on a Wednesday afternoon with ginger cookies and the warm, purposeful manner of a woman who had decided something needed to be said. Mrs. Elmore said what she had come to say with the complete warmth of someone who loved the person she was talking to, and who was talking to them because the love required it. And what she said was that the community had been noticing the fence line meetings and the visits to the Holt property, and that the noticing was not unkind, but that it was present, and that she wanted to make sure Ren was aware of what the noticing was saying because she deserved to know the social landscape she was operating in. Ren received it with the specific quality she had for things that required the reception. The composed, present quality of someone who was genuinely listening and who was not managing what she heard into a predetermined conclusion. She thanked Mrs. Elmore, and she saw her out, and she closed the door, and she stood in the kitchen with the ginger cookies on the table, and the December afternoon outside the window, and the specific quality of something that had arrived and that required the sitting with. She sat with it. She sat with it across the afternoon with the honest attention she had been developing, and what the sitting produced was not the anxiety she might have expected, and was not the shame that the previous version of herself might have reached for, and was not the management toward the comfortable conclusion. What it produced was clarity. The clarity of someone who had done enough of the interior work to understand what was being threatened by the external pressure and what the external pressure was asking her to choose between. The external pressure was asking her to choose between the managed social presentation and the actual ongoing experience of what was building at the fence line and the kitchen table. To choose between the version of herself that the community's framework expected and the version of herself that was being built from the accurate material. She understood this with the specific clarity of someone who had been through enough managed versions to recognize what the choosing toward the managed version would cost. And the cost was too specific and too clear to be acceptable. She went to him the following morning. Not the fence line. She went to the Holt property because the Holt property was where she needed to be, and because the going to him rather than waiting for the available occasion was itself the expression of the choosing. He was in the yard when she arrived, and he looked at her with the dark gray eyes and the patient waiting quality, and she said, "Mrs. Elmore came yesterday," he said. "I heard." She said, "The community is noticing." He said, "Yes." He said, "I expected they would." She said, "What did you expect they would say?" He said, "The things small communities said when adjacent widows and ranchers spent time at fence lines and kitchen tables." He said it with the dry, plain quality, and she said, "Does it concern you?" He was quiet for the honest length of time. He said, "The community's noticing does not change what is true about what has been building at the fence line and the kitchen table." He said, "What is true is not determined by the community's framework for it." She said, "No." She said, "It isn't." He said, "Does it concern you?" She said, "What concerns me is not the community's opinion." She said, "What concerns me is whether I'm going to let the community's opinion become the reason I return to the managed version." He said, "And are you going to?" She said, "No." She said, "I am not." She said it with the amber brown eyes and the plain, honest quality she had been learning from him across the months of the fence line conversations. The quality of the direct statement of the true thing in the form the true thing required, and he received it with the dark gray eyes and said, "Good." She said, "That is a short response." He said, "It contains everything I need to say." She said, "Tell me what it contains." He said, "Relief." He said, "And the specific confirmation that you have arrived at the understanding that I have been watching you build toward." She said, "You've been watching me build toward the refusing to return to the managed version." He said, "I've been watching you build toward the understanding that the accurate version is the one worth living from." He said, "The refusing to return to the managed version is the practical expression of the understanding." She said, "And the practical expression," he said, "Yes." He said, "Is the thing that matters." She said, "Yes." She said, "It is." She said, "Callum." He said, "Yes." She said, "I need to tell you something." He said, "Tell me." She said, "I have been in love with you since approximately the second Thursday of November." He said, "The one when you brought the tea." She said, "Yes." He said, "I know." She said, "You knew." He said, "Yes." He said, "I understood something had shifted on the second Thursday of November." He said, "I was waiting for you to arrive at the saying of it." She said, "How long have you been in love with me?" He said, "Since the Southfield in October." He said, "Since I told you what I saw, and I watched you receive it." He said, "The receiving of it told me something specific about who you were, that confirmed what I had been understanding across the 14 months. She said, "The receiving confirmed it." He said, "Yes." He said, "The way you received the accurate thing when you had never received it before told me that the capacity for it was entirely present and had been entirely present the whole time." He said the capacity for the genuine thing that had been given no genuine thing to receive was the specific quality that changed the understanding from observation to something else. She said something else. He said yes. He said something considerably more specific than observation. She said, tell me what it is. He said, it is the specific understanding that you are the person I have been building toward understanding for 7 years of paying attention to this valley. And that the valley's most significant feature has been here the whole time, and that I have been understanding that slowly and correctly across the 14 months, and that the understanding is complete. She said, the valley's most significant feature. He said, yes. He said, that is accurate. She said, you have been describing me as the valley's most significant feature. He said, I have been stating a fact about the valley. He said it with the dry plain quality, and she received it with the smile that was the genuine article. And she said, Callum Holt. He said, yes. She said, that is the most specific thing anyone has ever said to me. He said, it is the most accurate thing I know about the valley. She said, yes. She said, I believe you. He said, good. He said, you should. January arrived in Sagebrush Hollow with the specific authority of Wyoming January that was not interested in the particular comfort level of the people living inside it and that presented its full honest self from the first morning without the particular concession that some winter months made to the humans who had to be in them. The cold was complete and the light was the short, specific light of the latitude in the deep of the season, and the valley was the specific white and gray of serious Wyoming winter. And it was beautiful in the way that honest things were. Beautiful when they were entirely what they were, without management toward a more palatable version. Wren had been through 2 Wyoming Januaries, and this was the beginning of her 3rd, and she was receiving it with the quality of presence that was the quality she had been developing since October, and that had arrived by January at the form it was going to have. She was more herself in January than she had been in any month of the 4 years since she had started being less. This was the honest accounting of the interior, and she was doing the honest accounting because the honest accounting was the only kind she had available to herself, now that the wrong version had been named and put down gently in the way he had described. Gently and with the acknowledgement that it had been genuinely useful for its time, and that its time had passed. Putting down had not been a single event. It had been the ongoing work of the November and December weeks. The daily practice of choosing the accurate version when the default reached for the managed one, of catching the managed response before it completed itself and substituting the honest one. And the practice had produced the specific result that sustained practice produced, which was that the honest one was becoming available before the managed one rather than after it, was becoming the first reach rather than the corrected reach. She was doing the interior work with the quality that close to completion work had, the quality of something that was finding its natural form rather than being forced into a shape. And the form was the form of someone who was genuinely inhabiting their own life rather than managing it from a careful distance. She noticed this quality in the ordinary daily things in the way she was working in the fields, which was the way that had always been her way, when the work was in a domain where she had been permitted the full quality. But that was now extending into the domains where the full quality had previously been suppressed. The domains of how she was with the community and how she was at the kitchen table and how she was in the specific ongoing building of what was building with the man on the adjacent property who had given her the accurate material and who had been patient enough and present enough and accurate enough to have earned the specific trust she was placing in the building. She thought about what she was going to say to him. She had been thinking about it since the conversation at the Holt property in December when she had said the thing she had been building toward saying, and he had received it, and had said the things in return that told her the building had been correctly understood and that the arriving at the saying had been the correct arrival. She had been thinking about the next thing since then, not in the anxious way of someone who was managing toward a conclusion, but in the honest, patient way of someone who was allowing the next thing to develop at its own pace, and who trusted that the pace was the right pace because the pace was the honest one. She went to the Holt property on a Tuesday morning in the 2nd week of January when the work of the Callaway Farm's first tasks was complete, and the January morning had the specific clear cold quality of a morning that was honest about its temperature, and that was, in its honesty, one of the more beautiful mornings she had been through in the valley. He was at the eastern fence when she arrived. visible from the road in the specific way that the fence work placed him. And she went to him directly, rather than waiting for the available occasion, because the available occasion was no longer the mode she was operating from. He said, "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," she said. "I need to say something." He said, "Say it." She said, "I've been doing the interior work for 3 months." He said, "Yes." She said, "The work has been the work of understanding what the 4 years were and what they cost, and what the cost means about what I am now and what I want." He said, "Yes." She said, "I want to tell you what I want." He said, "Tell me." She said, "I want the building to continue." He said, "Yes." She said, "I want the building to have a direction that is more specific than the building." He said, "Tell me the specific direction." She said, "I want it to build toward the thing that the fence line conversations and the kitchen table conversations have been the beginning of." He said, "Tell me what you understand. That thing to be." She said, "I understand it to be the specific life of 2 people who have been learning each other for 17 months and who have found each other to be what the learning was looking for." He said, "Yes." He said, "That is what I understand it to be." She said, "I want to build that specifically." He said, "Yes." He said it with the plain quality and the dark gray eyes and the January morning around them and the specific warmth that the plain yes contained, which was all of what he had been understanding for. 17 months arriving at its natural expression in the form of the single word. She said, "Tell me what you want." He said, "I want the same building in the same direction." He said, "I want the valley's most significant feature to be on my side of the fence line." He said it with the dry quality and the dark gray eyes, and she received it with the amber brown eyes and the genuine smile, and said, "That is the most specific proposal I have received." He said, "I'm a specific person." She said, "Yes." She said, "You are." She said, "I need to tell you something." He said, "Tell me." She said, "The person you are building toward is not the person who existed before Thomas." He said, "I know." She said, "The person you are building toward is the person who has been through the 4 years and who has done the interior work and who is the specific result of the having been through and the having done the work." He said, "Yes." He said, "That is who I am building toward." He said, "Not the previous version." He said, "The current version." He said, "The current version is the one I have been observing and the one I have been in love with and the one that is here in the January morning telling me what she wants." She said, "And the current version is enough." He said, "The current version is what the 17 months of observation have been building the understanding of." He said, "The current version is entirely sufficient for everything I am proposing." She said, "You're certain?" He said, "I've been certain since the Southfield in October." He said, "I was waiting for you to be certain." She said, "And am I certain?" He said, "Tell me." She said, "Yes." She said, "I am certain." He said, "Then we agree." She said, "We agree." She said it, and he reached across the fence line, and he took her hands in both of his, the very large calloused hands that had been working the land on the other side of the fence for 7 years, and that she had been aware of across the fence line since September of the first year, in a way she had not had the language for until October of this one. And the warmth of them was the warmth she had understood was there from the quality of his presence before she had experienced it directly, and that was in the January morning at the fence line. Exactly what the understanding had told her it was going to be. She said, "Nobody's ever looked at me like that." She said it not in the way she had said it in the Southfield, which was the specific surprised recognition of someone encountering the thing they had not expected. She said it in the specific acknowledging way of someone who was naming a fact about their history for the purpose of the naming of it and what the naming meant. He said, "I know." He said, "That is the problem that is being addressed." She said, "You've been addressing it since October." He said, "I've been addressing it since September of the first year." He said, "October was when I told you about the addressing." She said, "You began the addressing in September of the first year." He said, "Yes." He said, "The first fence line meeting." He said, "The quality of the assessment of the fence section told me something about who you were that required the addressing." She said, "The way I assessed the fence." He said, "The way you assessed the fence told me you were someone who understood the actual thing in front of you rather than the thing you were supposed to see." and that the understanding of the actual thing was a quality that was present across all domains, and that the same quality was being directed at you through the wrong lens, and that the wrong lens was producing a distorted image, and that the distorted image was what you were being asked to believe was the accurate one. She said, "You understood all of that from the fence assessment." He said, "I understood the general shape of it from the fence assessment." He said, "The 17 months have been the understanding of the specific content." She said, "And the specific content." He said, "The specific content is you." He said, "Specifically." He said it with the plain quality, and she held his hands in the January morning and she said, "Callum Holt." He said, "Yes." She said, "You are the most specific person I have encountered." He said, "Yes." He said, "The specific things are the ones worth being." She said, "Ask me something you've been waiting to ask." He said, "Everything I've wanted to ask, I've asked at the fence line across 17 months. He said, "There is one thing that has not been a question, because it has been the direction the fence line and the kitchen table have been building toward, and that now, in the January morning, that is available as the direct question rather than the implied direction." She said, "Ask it." He said, "Will you marry me?" He said it with the same plain, honest quality. He said, everything that was true and important, without the construction of a ceremony and without the elaboration that would have turned the asking into a performance. Simply the direct statement of the thing he wanted and the question of whether she wanted it too. She said, "Yes." She said it with the same plain quality and the amber brown eyes that were showing everything, which was the thing that had been changing since October, and that was fully changed in the January morning at the fence line. The specific thing of showing what was actually there in the full quality rather than the managed portion. The specific most significant available evidence that the accurate version was the version she was living from. He said, "Good." She said, "That is the most complete response to a significant yes that I have encountered." He said, "It contains everything." She said, "Tell me what it contains." He said, "The specific quality of something arriving at the correct place after the correct amount of time and the correct quality of work." He said, "And the specific thing that is present when the arriving is genuine rather than performed, which is the quality of something that is simply right in the specific way that makes the elaboration unnecessary." She said, "It is simply right." He said, "Yes." He said, "It is simply right." She said, "Yes." She said, "It is." She said it, and the January morning was around them, and the fence line was between them, and the valley was the specific white and gray of the serious season, and it was entirely beautiful, and it was not entirely honest, and it was entirely what it was. She stepped through the gate in the fence line, the gate that was the natural opening in the boundary between the two properties, and that she had not stepped through before this morning. And she was on his side of the fence, and he was still holding her hands, and the fence was behind her. She said, "This side of the fence," he said. "Yes," she said, "is different from the other side." He said, "Yes," he said, "It is." She said, "Tell me how it is different." He said, "This side has you on it." He said it with the dry plain quality and the dark gray eyes, and she laughed. The genuine article, the specific unmanaged response to something genuinely funny from someone she was genuinely with. And the sound of it in the January morning was the sound of the thing she had described to herself as the smile reserved for when the spending was worth it. And that was being spent freely now because the spending was always worth it here. And she had understood this and was not going to manage it back into reserve. He said, "Tell me what you see." She said, "I see someone who has been looking at the accurate version for 17 months and who has given it back to me in the specific form that made the receiving possible." She said, "I see someone whose patience was not the patience of someone who was waiting for something they wanted, but the patience of someone who understood that the thing worth having required the time it required and who was not going to interfere with the time because the interfering would have produced an incomplete version, and the incomplete version was not what either of us deserved." He said, "Yes," he said, "that is what the patience was." She said, "I see someone whose eyes are the specific quality of eyes that see accurately and that communicate the seeing without performing it, and that are. Then in the specific quality of how they look at me, the most significant available evidence that the accurate version is worth looking at." He said, "Yes." He said, "It is." She said, And I see someone who has been filing beautiful things for 7 years and who is sharing them with me now, because the sharing is finally available in the specific form the sharing always required. He said, yes. He said, there is a significant accumulation. She said, I know. She said, I want all of it. He said, that will take some time. She said, yes. She said, I know. She said, that is why I want all of it. She was on his side of the fence. The January morning was around them. The valley was what it was in January, which was entirely itself and entirely honest. She was entirely herself. The accurate version. In the specific morning that was always going to be this one. February arrived in Sagebrush Hollow with the specific quality of a Wyoming February that was still fully winter, but that carried within the winter. For the people who had been paying the right kind of attention, the very earliest intimation of what was coming, not warmth, which was still months away, but the specific change in the quality of the light that began to happen in February at this latitude. The light beginning to stay a few minutes longer each day in a way that was not dramatic and not noticeable to someone who was not looking for it, and that was entirely present to someone who was. Callum had been noticing it for 7 years, and he had been telling her about it since December, and she was looking for it now with the specific quality of attention she had been developing since October. Which was the attention that was genuinely present in the world rather than the minimum necessary attention of someone who was managing their engagement with the world from a careful distance. She noticed it on the morning of the first Friday of February, the specific quality of the light being slightly more of itself than it had been the week before. And she stood at the kitchen window with the coffee, and she noticed it with the full quality of her attention, and she felt the specific quality of something received. The quality of the world offering something small and genuine to someone who was present enough to receive it. She had not been present enough to receive the small, genuine things for a long time. She was present enough now. The being present enough was the result of the October and November and December and January work. The sustained, patient, honest work of revising the wrong version and rebuilding from the accurate material. Then the result was the specific quality of someone who was inhabiting their life in the full, honest sense, rather than managing it from behind the careful distance. She was working differently in February. The commission work was at the level she was capable of, rather than the level she had been permitting herself to operate from. And the difference between those two levels was significant and visible in the work, and was being noticed by the people who commissioned the work, who were bringing more of it because the quality of what they were receiving was the quality that built reputation in the specific efficient way of good work in small communities. She was present in the community in a way she had not been present in the 3 years of the marriage and the 14 months of the widowhood, which was the way of someone who was genuinely there rather than executing the managed performance of being there. And the genuine presence was producing the genuine connections that the managed performance had kept at the careful distance. She and Callum had set the date for May. May was the month when the valley returned to itself after the winter, when the high country wildflowers came back to the creek sections and the light had the full quality it had been building toward since February, and when the land was the specific living version of itself that was the best available version. It was the correct month. She had understood that from the moment he had said May, and she had said yes with the same quality she had been bringing to most significant things since October, which was the quality of the direct, honest response to the direct, honest question without the managed version interposing itself between the question and the answer. The Holt property and the Callaway farm were going to become, after May, on a single operation managed by two people who understood the land from the same specific quality of attention and who had been adjacent to each other long enough to have the thorough mutual knowledge that the adjacency and the fence line conversations had produced. She had been thinking about this with the specific practical intelligence that was her characteristic mode for practical things, and the thinking had been producing the specific clarity of someone who understood what they were doing and why, and who had the capability for the doing, and who was bringing the full quality of the capability to the planning. He had been thinking about it with the same specific practical intelligence, and they had been talking about the thinking in the Wednesday visits and the Friday fence lines with the quality that all their conversations had, which was the quality of two people who were both genuinely interested in the same problem, and who were genuinely interested in each other, and who found the combination of those two things to produce the best available version of the thinking. She had told him about the specific interior work of the February weeks on a Friday morning at the fence line, which was the form of the telling that had become the established form. The ongoing honest report of someone who was doing significant work and who had found the person worth reporting to. She had told him about the quality of the being present enough and what it felt like to be receiving the small genuine things that had not been available when the minimum necessary attention was the mode. He had listened with the complete quality and had said, "Tell me what the receiving feels like." She had said, "It feels like the accurate version of what I always understood receiving to mean, but had not been experiencing." He had said, "Yes." She had said, "It feels like the world is genuinely offering things, and I am genuinely taking them rather than the world being a thing I was managing." He had said, "Yes." He had said, "That is the difference between living in a place and managing a stay in a place." She had said, "I've been managing a stay." He had said, "You have been living here since October." She had said, "Since October." He had said, "Yes." She had said, "You were watching the transition." He had said, "Yes." He had said, "The transition was the most significant thing I have observed in 7 years of paying attention to this valley." She had said, "More significant than the October light." He had said, "Considerably." He had said it with the dark gray eyes and the warmth in them that was simply his quality when he was looking at her. And she had received it with the amber brown eyes and the full presence that was hers now, and that was, in the February morning, simply how she was. He asked her on the last Saturday of February if she was ready to tell the thing she had been holding at the center for the months of the processing. Not pressuring the telling, asking if the readiness was there because the readiness was the determining variable and he was simply checking the variable, rather than creating pressure toward a result. She understood the distinction, because she had learned to understand his distinctions across the months. The specific difference between the question that was checking and the question that was pushing. She said, "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." They were at the kitchen table with the coffee and the February light through the window, and she told him the center. She told him the full true thing about the 3 years, with the honest quality she had been building towards since October. Not the managed version and not the partial version, but the complete accurate version. The version that named the thing for what it was and that did not use the indirect language that softened it into something more acceptable. He received the full true thing with the complete quality for the full duration, and when she finished, he was quiet for the weight-giving length of time, and then he said, "You have been carrying the full accurate weight of that for longer than anyone should carry it alone." She said, "Yes." He said, "You carried it correctly." He said, "The carrying was what was available, and you did it with everything you had." She said, "The everything I had was depleted from the carrying." He said, "Yes." He said, "And you rebuilt it." He said, "In the 14 months, and in the specific months since October." He said, "You rebuilt it from the accurate material." She said, "Yes." He said, "That is the specific thing." He said, "Not the carrying and not the depleting, which were both real and were both significant." He said, "The rebuilding from the accurate material." He said, "That is the thing that is yours and that no one can revise or diminish." She said, "Yes." She said, "It is mine." He said, "Yes." He said, "It is." He said it with the plain, complete quality, and she received it with the full quality, and neither of them said anything further because the saying anything further would have been the elaboration. The elaboration was not needed. There is a lesson in Ren Calloway's story that belongs to everyone who has been given the wrong version of themselves by someone who had the specific interest in the wrong version being the one you operated from, and who has been operating from the wrong version for long enough that the questioning of it required more interior resources than the wrong version had left available for the questioning. The lesson is not that the questioning is easy. The questioning is not easy. The questioning requires the specific conditions that make it possible, which are the conditions of someone who gives you the accurate version and who gives it in the form that permits the receiving, which is the direct, honest form of someone who is not performing the saying, but is simply stating what is true. That is what he gave her. He did not rescue her from the wrong version. He gave her the information that the wrong version was wrong, and he gave it in the form of the direct, honest observation of someone for whom she was the reason for the observation. And the giving of it in that form was the specific thing that made the receiving possible. You cannot receive the accurate version from someone who is giving it to you for their own purposes. You can only receive it from someone for whom you are the reason for the giving. He was watching her across the south field because she was worth watching. He was watching her with the quality of attention that was organized around who she actually was because who she actually was warranted that quality of attention. And when she asked him what he saw, he told her the true thing in the plain form, the true thing required. Not as a kindness and not as a gesture and not as the particular social production of someone who wanted to produce a specific result in her, but as the accurate report of what was there from someone who had been paying the right quality of attention for long enough to have the thorough understanding. Nobody's ever looked at me like that. She had said it as the surprised recognition of something she had not expected to encounter. He had said, "I know, that's exactly the problem." He had said it as the accurate identification of the condition, not a reproach to anything or anyone, but the specific naming of the thing that needed to be named, which was that the right quality of looking had not been present in her life, and that the absence of it had been a problem in the specific sense of something that was missing that should not have been missing. You are worth the right quality of looking. You have always been worth the right quality of looking. The question was only whether the right quality was available and whether you were in a position to receive it when it was. The position to receive it was the position that the interior work built. And the interior work was the specific work of understanding that the wrong version was wrong, and that the accurate material was always the accurate material, and that the accurate material was yours. The south field is there, the October morning is there. The person who has been paying the right kind of attention for long enough to have the thorough understanding is at the fence line with the dark gray eyes and the honest face and the very large, calloused hands that are warm in the specific way of things that are genuinely what they are. Ask him what he sees. He will tell you the truth. The truth is better than the wrong version. The truth is you. May you find the strength to heal and the hope of a new dawn. Thank you for listening. This story is a work of fiction. Characters, places, and events are products of the author's imagination. All rights reserved by Cowboy Ironheart.